April 20th, 1999, dawned like a normal day for most students at Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado. However, what would follow would be one of the most impactful and studied tragedies in American history: the Columbine High School Massacre. Two senior students, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, armed with an arsenal of weapons and explosives, unleashed an attack that would result in the deaths of 12 students and one teacher, in addition to injuring dozens of others, before committing suicide. The motives behind acts of violence as extreme as the Columbine Massacre are, by nature, intricate and rarely one-dimensional. In the case of Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, the analysis of their behaviors, writings, and history reveals a complex web of psychological, social, and environmental factors that culminated in the tragedy. To understand Columbine, it's crucial to delve into the complex dynamic between its perpetrators. Eric Harris was, for many, the mastermind of the operation. Intelligent, but with clear traits of psychopathy, he exhibited grandiose behavior, a lack of empathy, and a deep contempt for human life. His diaries and writings reveal a mind full of hatred, fantasies of domination, and an ardent desire to destroy the world. Harris was the dominant leader of the duo, instigating and controlling many of their actions. Eric Harris is frequently described as the more calculating and dominant of the duo. Criminal psychology experts, after extensively analyzing his diaries, videos, and behavior, identified significant traits of psychopathy in him. Psychopathy is not synonymous with insanity, but rather a personality disorder characterized by a series of traits, including lack of empathy, inability to feel or understand others' emotions, leading to brutal indifference to the suffering of others, grandiosity and egocentrism, an inflated view of oneself, with a sense of superiority and disdain for social and moral rules. Harris often saw himself as a god or a superior being to common humans. Manipulation and deceit, ability to manipulate people and situations for his own benefit, lying and deceiving without remorse, impulsivity and antisocial behavior, tendency to act without considering the consequences, and a propensity to violate social and legal norms, lack of remorse, inability to feel guilt or regret for his actions, no matter how heinous they are. Harris's writings are filled with fantasies of domination, annihilation, and a deep hatred for humanity. He saw the school and his peers as targets for his revenge, believing they had marginalized and humiliated him. His main motivation seemed to be a desire for power and notoriety, to leave his mark on the world through an act of massive destruction that would make him remembered. Dylan Klebold, on the other hand, was more introspective and, according to later investigations, suffered from severe depression. He seemed to have a more submissive personality in relation to Harris, but his anger and despair were equally potent. In his writings, Klebold expressed suicidal thoughts and a deep feeling of alienation and loneliness. Although both were fascinated by violence and weapons, their motivations seemed to differ. Harris sought power and recognition through mass destruction, while Klebold seemed to be in a downward spiral of self-destruction, seeking a way to escape his own pain. Both shared a feeling of marginalization and resentment towards school culture and the bullies they believed had oppressed them. However, the idea that bullying was the sole cause of the massacre is a primary oversimplification. Their violent tendencies and pre-existing psychological problems were exacerbated by this perception of exclusion. They spent months meticulously planning the attack, illegally acquiring firearms and building homemade bombs with the aim of surpassing the deadliest terrorist attacks in history. Just a quick break to ask you to like, subscribe, share, and comment on what true crime story you'd like to see on our channel. April 20th, 1999 began as a common spring morning in Littleton, Colorado, but it would transform into one of the darkest dates in American history. Columbine High School was preparing for a normal day of classes, but, behind the scenes, teenagers, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, were about to unleash a premeditated hell. Harris and Klebold's plan was terrifying in its magnitude and demonstrated their coldness and contempt for life. They had planned a miniature version of the Oklahoma City terrorist attack. The goal was to detonate homemade bombs, made from 20-pound propane tanks, inside the school cafeteria during the peak lunch hour. The idea was for the explosions to kill hundreds of students, forcing survivors to flee the building. Outside the school, Harris and Klebold would be armed, waiting to shoot those who tried to escape. They hoped to surpass the death toll of Oklahoma City, which had been 168 people. Around 11:14 a.m., the two gunmen placed the bombs in the cafeteria and headed to their cars. The plan was to wait for a detonation that never happened. Due to a timing error, a defect in the detonators, or some other technical fault, the bombs did not explode. This crucial failure, although it did not prevent the tragedy, drastically reduced the number of fatalities the gunmen intended. Frustrated with the bomb's failure, Harris and Klebold shifted the focus of their attack. At 11:19, they moved to the outside of the school, near the west entrance. Armed with an arsenal, Harris with a 12-gauge shotgun and a high-point .995 carbine, and Klebold with a 12-gauge sawed-off shotgun and a 9mm TECDC-9 handgun. The first shots were fired. Rachel Scott, 17, was eating lunch on the grass with a friend when she was hit and killed by Harris. Soon after, Daniel Rawbo, 15, was shot while trying to flee. Panic began to spread as students realized this was no joke or drill. After shooting some other students outside and in the hallways, Harris and Klebold entered the school, eventually heading to the library. Upstairs, this location would become the epicenter of horror. At that moment, about 50 students and 2 staff members were in the library. The shooters' behavior in the library was particularly sadistic and cold. They moved between the tables, firing indiscriminately at students hiding under tables or trying to shield themselves. There was a moment of shocking cruelty where they taunted their victims, asking about their religious beliefs before shooting. 10 of the 13 people killed in the massacre were murdered in the library. Among the library victims were Cassie Benall, who was allegedly asked about her faith before being killed, though the exact veracity of the dialogue has been debated, and Stephen Curnow, the first to be killed in the library. Teacher Dave Sanders, 47, a hero who helped evacuate dozens of students, was shot by the gunman and, despite efforts to save him, eventually died of his wounds hours later. The authorities' response was initially confused and disorganized. At the time, police protocols for active shooters in schools were non-existent. Police were instructed to establish a perimeter and wait for SWAT teams, instead of immediately entering to neutralize the act. This decision, understandable for the time, allowed Harris and Klebold to continue their attack for an extended period. SWAT teams only entered the school approximately 1 hour after the shooting began. However, around 12 o'clock and 8 minutes after uninterrupted terror, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold committed suicide in the library, with self-inflicted gunshots to the head. Their bodies were found among those of their victims. In addition to the individual psychological complexities of Harris and Klebold, other factors were frequently cited as contributors to the massacre. Although their influence is debated, bullying and social ostracism, both shooters claimed to be victims of bullying and felt excluded. While bullying is a serious problem and can exacerbate feelings of anger and isolation, it is not a sufficient explanation for extreme violence. Many individuals experience bullying without resorting to acts of terror. However, the perception of being victims may have fueled resentment and a desire for revenge. Fascination with violence and goth culture. Harris and Klebold were fascinated by violent video games, movies, music, and, to some extent, the goth subculture, which at the time was mistakenly linked to Satanism and violence by the media. While these elements could reinforce their existing tendencies, they are not direct causes of violence. Access to weapons and explosives. The ease with which the teenagers acquired an arsenal of firearms with the help of accomplices and through illegal means and built homemade bombs was a critical factor in the scale of the massacre. Without these tools, the tragedy would have been of a much smaller dimension. Communication failures and ignored warning signs before the attack. There were multiple warning signs. Eric Harris had a website with explicit threats, and his parents were alerted about his aggressive behavior. Police reports were made but were not effectively followed up on. The lack of coordination among authorities and the absence of early intervention are critical points of failure. Ultimately, the complex motives behind the Columbine shooters cannot be reduced to a single cause. It was a devastating interaction of severe psychological problems, feelings of alienation, access to weapons, and the system's failure to identify and intervene on warning signs. The study of Columbine and other similar massacres continues to be fundamental to understanding how to prevent future tragedies. If this in-depth account of the Columbine Massacre was helpful to you, please consider liking this content and subscribing to the channel so you don't miss future analyses and important discussions. Your participation helps us continue to bring information and reflections on relevant topics.